Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Perfect Facade. Cameron Anderson had always believed in the sanctity of family. At 38, he was a successful construction foreman with calloused hands and an unwavering moral compass. His marriage to Michelle Underwood had seemed like a fairy tale 15 years ago. She was beautiful, charming, and came from what appeared to be a respectable family. Their daughter Stacy, now 13, was the light of his life. But perfection, Cameron had learned, was often just a carefully constructed lie. The Underwood family gatherings had become increasingly uncomfortable over the years. Muhammad Underwood, Michelle's father, was a domineering man in his 60s who believed respect was earned through fear. Suzanne Underwood, Michelle's mother, enabled every one of his outbursts with silent compliance. What troubled Cameron most was how Michelle had begun adopting their toxic dynamics. "Stacy, you're embarrassing us," Michelle hissed during last Sunday's dinner, when their daughter had accidentally knocked over her water glass. "Can't you sit properly like a lady?" Cameron had intervened then, gently helping Stacy clean up while shooting his wife a disapproving look. Michelle's eyes had flashed with something cold and unfamiliar. That evening, Cameron noticed Michelle texting someone frequently, her phone tilted away from him. When he casually asked who she was messaging, she'd snapped it shut. "Just work stuff," she'd said, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. The signs had been there for months: late nights at client meetings, new clothes she claimed were gifts from friends, and an emotional distance that seemed to grow wider each day. Cameron's construction business was thriving, providing them with a comfortable lifestyle in their suburban home. But Michelle's real estate career had become her excuse for everything. "Dad, I don't want to go to Grandpa Muhammad's house anymore," Stacy had confided in him just last week. "He scares me." Cameron had knelt down to her level, studying her serious brown eyes, so much like his own. "Why, sweetheart? He yells a lot, and Mom never stands up for me anymore." The words had cut deep. Cameron remembered the Michelle he'd fallen in love with, the woman who'd dreamed of being the mother she never had. Now, she seemed to be becoming exactly what she'd once despised. Tonight, as Cameron sat in his study reviewing construction blueprints, he could hear Michelle on the phone in their bedroom. Her voice was soft, almost purring, a tone she hadn't used with him in months. "I can't wait to see you tomorrow," she whispered. Cameron will be at the Morrison site all day. A cold rage began to build in Cameron's chest. He'd suspected, but hearing the confirmation was like a physical blow. 15 years of marriage, 13 years of raising a daughter together, and this was how it ended, with whispered phone calls and secret meetings. Cameron Anderson had built his reputation on being a man of his word. When he committed to something, he saw it through to the end. When he was wronged, he remembered every detail. And when he decided someone had crossed a line they could never uncross, he made sure they understood the consequences. As Michelle's laughter drifted through the walls, Cameron made a decision that would change everything. He wouldn't confront her yet. Instead, he would watch, learn, and prepare. Because if there was one thing his years in construction had taught him, it was that the strongest foundations were built slowly and carefully. And when the time came to tear something down, you had to know exactly where to place the charges. Chapter 2. The Breaking Point. 3 weeks of careful observation had given Cameron a complete picture of his wife's betrayal. Michelle was having an affair with Wade Willis, a smooth-talking real estate developer who'd been circling their social circle like a predator. Wade was 42, divorced, and known for his expensive taste and wandering eye. Cameron had followed them twice to a downtown hotel, photographed them together, and even managed to overhear enough of their conversations to understand this wasn't just physical. Michelle was sharing intimate details about their marriage, mocking Cameron's blue-collar mentality and complaining about feeling trapped in suburban mediocrity. But it was today that everything would shatter beyond repair. The family gathering at the Underwood house started like any other. Muhammad held court in his recliner, criticizing everything from the government to his neighbors. Suzanne fluttered around serving drinks and making excuses for his behavior. Michelle sat beside Wade, who'd been invited as a family friend, touching his arm whenever she laughed at his jokes. Cameron watched it all with the cold calculation of a man planning demolition. "Stacy, come here," Muhammad commanded from his chair. "I want to talk to you about your grades." 13-year-old Stacy approached cautiously. Cameron could see the tension in her small shoulders. "Your mother tells me you got a B+ in math. That's not good enough. In my day, children were grateful for education and worked harder." "I did work hard, Grandpa," Stacy said quietly. "It's just difficult sometimes." Muhammad's face darkened. "Don't talk back to me, girl. You're getting soft because your father coddles you." Cameron felt his muscles tense, but he forced himself to remain still. He needed to see how far this would go. "She's just a child, Dad," Michelle said, but her voice lacked conviction. She was more interested in Wade's hand on her knee. "That's the problem." Muhammad stood up, his voice rising. "No discipline, no respect. When I was your age, children knew their place." Stacy backed away slightly, fear evident in her eyes. "I'm sorry, Grandpa. I'll try harder." "Sorry isn't enough." Muhammad reached for the decorative brick that served as a bookend on the nearby shelf. "You need to learn what happens when you don't listen." What happened next would replay in Cameron's mind for the rest of his life. Muhammad swung the brick, striking Stacy across the left side of her face with a sickening thud. She crumpled to the floor, blood streaming from her nose and mouth. "Next time when I speak to you, listen to me," Muhammad shouted at the sobbing, injured child. Cameron was moving before conscious thought took over, but Michelle's reaction stopped him cold. She was laughing. "Well," Michelle said, smiling at Wade as if sharing an inside joke, "tell your pathetic daughter how to respect her superior." The room fell silent except for Stacy's crying. Cameron knelt beside his daughter, his hands shaking as he assessed her injuries. Her nose was clearly broken, her lips split, and blood was already swelling around her left eye. "We're going to the hospital," Cameron said, his voice deadly quiet as he lifted Stacy into his arms. "Oh, please," Suzanne called out casually as they headed for the door. "Bring us some beer on the way back. We're running low." Cameron stopped at the threshold, turning back to look at each of them. Muhammad standing proud and unrepentant, Suzanne worried about her beer supply, Wade smirking with amusement, and Michelle still laughing softly at what she clearly saw as justified discipline. "I'll be sure to bring something back," Cameron said. "I promise." At the hospital, as doctors worked on Stacy's broken nose and stitched her lip, Cameron made phone calls. The first was to Harvey Mason, his oldest friend and a private investigator who'd helped Cameron vet potential employees with troubled backgrounds. "Harv, I need everything you can find on Wade Willis. Financial records, personal history, weaknesses, everything. What's going on, Cam? Someone hurt my daughter, and I'm going to make sure they understand what that means." The second call was to his lawyer. The third was to his bank. By the time Stacy was discharged with a splint on her nose and strict instructions for care, Cameron had set several wheels in motion. As promised, he did return to the Underwood house that evening. But instead of beer, he brought legal documents, divorce papers, a restraining order, and a formal report he'd filed with Child Protective Services detailing the assault on his daughter. The papers were served simultaneously to Muhammad, assault charges, Michelle, divorce and emergency custody papers, and delivered by courier to Wade Willis, a cease and desist order regarding contact with his family. "You can't do this," Michelle screamed as Cameron collected Stacy's belongings. "You're overreacting. It was just discipline." Cameron looked at his wife, really looked at her, and saw a stranger. "You laughed when someone broke our daughter's nose. You called her pathetic. There's no coming back from that, Michelle. Wade will help me fight this. You can't just take Stacy. Wade will help you." Cameron smiled coldly. "We'll see about that." As they left the Underwood house for the final time, Stacy clinging to his hand with her uninjured side, Cameron felt something fundamental shift inside him. The man who tried to see the good in everyone, who'd made excuses for his wife's family's behavior, who believed in redemption and second chances, that man was gone. In his place stood someone much more dangerous, a father who'd learned that some lines, once crossed, could never be uncrossed. And Cameron Anderson never forgot a betrayal. Chapter 3. The foundation of revenge. 2 months after the assault, Cameron's life had transformed completely. The divorce proceedings were moving forward, with Michelle fighting desperately for custody and financial support. But Cameron had advantages she hadn't anticipated: his clean record, stable employment, and most importantly, the medical records and police report from Stacy's assault. Wade Willis had tried to distance himself once legal papers started flying, but Michelle wasn't letting him go easily. Cameron watched with cold satisfaction as she grew increasingly desperate, calling Wade constantly and showing up at his office unannounced. "She's becoming a liability," Cameron overheard Wade telling someone during a phone conversation he'd recorded using equipment Harvey Mason had provided. "The crazy bitch thinks I'm going to marry her or something." Cameron had rented a small apartment near Stacy's school while the house was being valued for asset division. Stacy was thriving in the new environment, away from the toxic influence of her mother and the Underwood family. Her nose had healed well, but the emotional scars ran deeper. "Dad," she'd asked one evening while they worked on homework together, "why did Mom laugh when Grandpa hurt me?" Cameron had struggled with that question himself. "Sometimes people become different than who we thought they were, sweetheart. Sometimes they make choices that show us who they really are inside. Are you going to hurt them back?" The question had caught him off guard with its directness. "Why do you ask?" "Because you're different now, too. You're harder." She was right. The old Cameron would have tried to find a peaceful resolution, would have focused on protecting Stacy and moving forward. But the old Cameron hadn't watched his wife laugh while their daughter bled on the floor. Harvey's investigation had revealed interesting details about Wade's business practices. Not quite illegal, but certainly unethical. He'd been buying properties in low-income neighborhoods, making minimal improvements, then flipping them to desperate families at inflated prices. When those families inevitably defaulted, he'd foreclose and repeat the cycle. "He's a predator," Harvey explained over coffee in Cameron's apartment. "Targets vulnerable people, especially single mothers. Your wife isn't his first married woman, either. I found 3 others in the past 5 years. What happened to them? All divorced, all left with nothing. He's got a pattern: seduces married women, helps destroy their marriages, then discards them when they become too clingy." Cameron studied the photographs and documents Harvey had compiled. "What about Muhammad?" "That's more interesting. He's got a history of violence going back decades. Never charged because his victims were family members who wouldn't press charges. But there's a pattern of escalating behavior. And Suzanne, enabler, classic battered wife syndrome, but she's also financially dependent. Muhammad controls everything: bank accounts, property, even her medications." Cameron spent the next week digesting this information and formulating a plan. The old Cameron would have settled for winning custody of Stacy and starting fresh. But these people had shown him something ugly about human nature: that some individuals would hurt children, mock suffering, and enable monsters as long as it served their interests. They made a fundamental error in judgment. They'd assumed Cameron was weak because he was patient. They'd confused his kindness for cowardice. The plan that emerged was methodical and multi-layered. It would take time, resources, and a willingness to embrace methods that would have horrified his former self. But as Cameron looked at Stacy's school photo, where a faint scar still marked her upper lip, he felt no hesitation. Phase 1 began with a seemingly innocent real estate investment. Cameron used his construction expertise to identify a rundown apartment complex in one of Wade's target neighborhoods. But instead of flipping it quickly, Cameron planned to renovate it properly and offer affordable housing with flexible payment plans. It would cost Wade potential victims and mark Cameron as a competitor in Wade's hunting ground. Phase 2 involved Muhammad's past. Harvey had identified 2 of Muhammad's previous victims: a nephew who'd been hospitalized with a fall downstairs at age 16, and a neighbor's child who'd suffered a broken arm during one of Muhammad's discipline sessions years ago. Both were now adults who'd never received justice. Cameron had Harvey reach out to them with an interesting proposition. Phase 3 was the most complex. It involved Michelle's growing desperation, Wade's pattern of abandonment, and a carefully orchestrated scenario that would force both of them to reveal their true nature in a way that would have lasting consequences. "Are you sure about this, Cam?" Harvey asked after reviewing the complete plan. "This goes way beyond just protecting Stacy. This is about destroying them." Cameron looked out the window of his apartment, where Stacy was playing in the courtyard with new friends from her school, children whose parents didn't believe in hitting kids with bricks. They had a choice, Harv. When Muhammad picked up that brick, when Michelle laughed, when Suzanne asked for beer, they all had a choice. They chose to be the kind of people who hurt children and mock suffering. "And you're choosing to be what?" Cameron turned back to his friend, and Harvey saw something in his eyes that made him understand why Cameron had been so successful in construction. When Cameron Anderson decided to build something, he built it to last. And when he decided to tear something down, he made sure it never stood again. "I'm choosing to be their consequences." The war was about to begin, and Cameron Anderson had spent 2 months building the perfect foundation for systematic revenge. Chapter 4. Laying the groundwork. 6 months had passed since the divorce proceedings began, and Cameron's transformation was complete. The gentle family man had evolved into something far more calculating and dangerous. He'd won primary custody of Stacy, with Michelle granted only supervised visits after a court-appointed psychologist noted her concerning lack of empathy regarding the child's traumatic experience. Cameron's first real estate investment was paying dividends in more ways than one. The Riverside Apartments, once a squalid complex Wade had earmarked for his predatory scheme, was now a model of affordable housing. Cameron had hired a team that included 3 of Wade's former victims, single mothers who'd lost their homes to his foreclosure scams. Mr. Anderson, one of them, Rosa Spaulding, told him during a tenant meeting, "You don't know what this means to us. Having a landlord who actually cares about families instead of just profit." Cameron smiled, but his eyes remained cold. "Everyone deserves a second chance, Rosa. Some people, though, they don't deserve a first one." Wade had noticed the competition. He'd even approached Cameron directly at a Chamber of Commerce meeting, all false charm and veiled threats. "Cameron Anderson, right? Heard you've been playing in my neighborhood." Wade's smile was predatory. "Construction, guy moving into real estate. That's ambitious." "Just helping families find stable housing," Cameron replied mildly. "Something you might consider." Wade's mask slipped slightly. "Listen, friend, that area has its own ecosystem. You might find it more complicated than building houses." "Threats, Wade." Friendly advice. From one businessman to another. Cameron had recorded the entire conversation, adding it to the growing file Harvey was compiling. But more importantly, it confirmed that Wade was feeling pressure. Meanwhile, Muhammad's situation was deteriorating rapidly. Harvey had helped Cameron's ally, Jamie Middleton, Muhammad's nephew who'd been disciplined at 16, file a formal complaint with Adult Protective Services about Muhammad's treatment of Suzanne. The investigation revealed concerning patterns of financial control and psychological abuse. More significantly, Cameron had purchased the small house Muhammad rented from his elderly landlord. The sale had been legitimate and legal, processed through a subsidiary company Cameron had established. Muhammad had no idea his new landlord was the man whose daughter he'd assaulted. Eviction. Muhammad had raged when the 30-day notice arrived. On what grounds? The grounds were simple. Conversion of the property to owner-occupied housing. Completely legal, properly documented, and absolutely devastating to a man living on a fixed income with no savings. Michelle was spiraling. Wade had grown tired of her increasingly desperate attempts to formalize their relationship, especially after the legal complications surrounding the divorce made her a liability. She'd started drinking heavily and calling Cameron at all hours, alternating between threats and pleas for reconciliation. "You're destroying our family," she'd screamed during one late-night call. "Stacy needs her mother." "Stacy needs a mother who doesn't laugh when she's assaulted," Cameron had replied calmly. "You're not that person. Wade says you're jealous. He says you're trying to ruin successful people because you're just a blue-collar nobody." "Is that what Wade says?" Interesting. What Wade didn't know was that Cameron had been systematically undermining his business empire using methods far more sophisticated than simple competition. Harvey had introduced Cameron to Rex Lamb, a forensic accountant with a particular expertise in real estate fraud. Wade's operation is more vulnerable than he realizes, Rex explained during a meeting in Cameron's apartment. His whole business model depends on information asymmetry, knowing which properties are about to go into foreclosure before the families do. But that information comes from inside sources at banks and the courthouse. Sources that can be compromised. Sources that can be replaced. Or fed false information. Or convinced that their cooperation with Wade might not be as secret as they think. Cameron approved the plan. Within weeks, Wade found himself chasing leads on properties that didn't exist, making offers on houses that had already been sold, and missing legitimate opportunities because his information network had been quietly poisoned. But the most devastating blow came from an unexpected source, Stacy herself. "Dad," she said one evening while they prepared dinner together, "I want to testify." Cameron stopped chopping vegetables. "Testify about what, sweetheart?" "About what Grandpa Muhammad did, and about Mom laughing. I want to tell a judge, so it's official." "Stacy, you don't have to." "Yes, I do." Her voice was steady, more mature than any 13-year-old should sound. "Because if I don't, he might hurt another kid, and Mom might help him." The formal deposition was scheduled for the following month. Michelle's lawyer tried desperately to block it, arguing that it would be traumatic for the child. But Stacy's insistence, combined with Child Advocacy Services support, made it inevitable. Wade tried one more approach to salvage his situation, sending an intermediary to offer Cameron a business partnership in exchange for backing off the real estate competition. Cameron's response was delivered through Harvey. "Tell Mr. Willis that some partnerships are too expensive, and some people can't be bought." As winter approached, Cameron reviewed the progress of his campaign. Muhammad was facing eviction and potential criminal charges. Michelle was isolated, broke, and abandoned by her lover. Wade was hemorrhaging money and losing his information network. But this was still just the foundation. The real construction was about to begin. And Cameron Anderson had learned that the most devastating collapses happened slowly, methodically, and without warning, right up until the moment the structure could no longer support its own weight. Chapter 5. Applying Pressure. The deposition had been devastating. Stacy, now 14 and demonstrating remarkable composure, testified for 3 hours about the assault and its aftermath. Her account was detailed, heartbreaking, and legally bulletproof. She described not just the physical violence, but the emotional trauma of watching her mother laugh at her pain. "My mom told Mr. Willis that I was pathetic and needed to learn respect," Stacy said, looking directly at the court reporter. "She wasn't upset that I was hurt. She was proud of Grandpa Muhammad for hurting me." Michelle's lawyer tried to object, but the damage was done. The recording would become part of the permanent legal record, ensuring that Michelle's actions would follow her forever. Outside the courthouse, Michelle confronted Cameron directly for the first time in months. "You're turning her against me," she screamed, causing passers-by to stare. "Poisoning her mind." "I didn't have to," Cameron replied calmly. "You did that yourself when you laughed. Wade was right about you. You're sick, obsessed. You'll never move on because you can't accept that I found someone better." Cameron smiled, an expression that made Michelle step back involuntarily. "How is Wade, by the way? Still taking your calls?" The look of pain that crossed Michelle's face told Cameron everything he needed to know. Wade had finally cut ties completely, leaving her isolated and desperate. What Michelle didn't know was that Wade's abandonment wasn't entirely voluntary. Cameron's systematic campaign had made Wade's life increasingly complicated. His information network had collapsed, costing him hundreds of thousands in missed opportunities and bad investments. Worse, Rex Lamb had identified several of Wade's transactions that bordered on fraud, nothing immediately prosecutable, but enough to make him radioactive to legitimate business partners. The final straw had come when Cameron arranged for Rosa, Spaulding, and 2 other victims of Wade's schemes to attend a real estate development conference where Wade was speaking. They'd asked pointed questions during the Q&A session about his foreclosure practices, creating a public relations nightmare that had gone viral on social media. Wade Willis, the slumlord, became a trending hashtag, complete with photos of families he displaced and testimonials from his victims. Meanwhile, Muhammad's situation had become dire. The eviction was proceeding on schedule, but Cameron had another surprise waiting. Harvey had located Muhammad's former neighbor whose child had been injured years ago, a woman named Krista Hurst who was now a successful nurse and child advocate. "I never forgot what he did to my son," Krista told Cameron during a meeting at his office. Billy was only 8, and Muhammad hit him with a garden hoe for retrieving a ball from his yard. "Broke 2 ribs. Why didn't you press charges then? We were renters, barely making ends meet. Muhammad convinced us that if we made trouble, we'd be evicted and Billy would be taken away by social services. We were young and scared. And now," Krista's smile was fierce, "now I know the system, I have resources, and I'm not afraid of bullies anymore." The assault charges against Muhammad for the attack on Stacy were already pending, but adding Billy's case, even decades later, would establish a pattern of predatory behavior that would virtually guarantee jail time. Cameron's web was tightening, but he wanted more than just legal victory. He wanted complete devastation. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, Suzanne herself. Harvey had maintained careful surveillance of the Underwood household during Muhammad's slow-motion collapse. What they discovered was that Suzanne had been secretly recording Muhammad's violent outbursts for years, initially as evidence for a divorce she'd never had the courage to file. "She's terrified," Harvey reported, "but she's also angry. Decades of abuse, and now she's facing homelessness because of his behavior." Cameron made a personal visit to Suzanne, arriving at the house just after Muhammad had left for his daily routine at the neighborhood bar. "Mrs. Underwood," he said when she answered the door, "I think it's time we talked." Susan looked older than her 62 years, worn down by decades of fear and enabling. But there was something different in her eyes now, a flicker of defiance. "Cameron, I know you must hate me. I don't hate you, Suzanne. I pity you. But more importantly, I have an offer." Over the next hour, Cameron laid out a proposition that was both generous and strategic. He would help Suzanne establish independence, a small apartment, financial assistance, and legal protection from Muhammad's retaliation. In exchange, she would provide her recordings and testify about Muhammad's history of violence. "He'll kill me," she whispered. "No," Cameron said firmly. "He'll be in jail, and if he ever gets out, he'll know that hurting you means dealing with me." The recordings were even more damning than Cameron had hoped. Hours of Muhammad's rages, threats, and admissions of past violence. In one particularly chilling segment, he bragged about teaching children respect and expressed regret that nowadays you can't discipline kids properly without bleeding hearts interfering. But Cameron saved the most devastating revelation for last. Through Rex's financial investigation, they discovered that Wade had been systematically stealing from his own company, skimming money from real estate deals to fund his gambling addiction. The evidence was ironclad: falsified documents, diverted funds, and a pattern of embezzlement that went back 3 years. More interesting was the timing. Wade had accelerated his theft after beginning his affair with Michelle, using stolen money to finance their hotel meetings and expensive gifts. Cameron arranged for this information to reach Wade's business partners anonymously, but with enough detail to trigger an immediate internal investigation. Within 48 hours, Wade was fired and facing potential criminal charges. Desperate and cornered, Wade made a fatal error. He called Michelle, begging her to provide an alibi for his activities during specific dates when embezzlement had occurred. "Just tell them we were together on business," Wade pleaded during a call Cameron had anticipated and recorded. "It's not really lying. We were discussing real estate. You want me to commit perjury for you? Baby, please. After everything we've meant to each other." Michelle's response was illuminating. "We don't mean anything to each other, Wade. We never did. I was a distraction, and you're my exit strategy. Now we're both screwed." The call ended with Wade realizing he'd been used as thoroughly as he'd used others. As Cameron reviewed the progress of his campaign, he felt a cold satisfaction. Muhammad was facing eviction, assault charges, and abandonment by his own wife. Michelle was broke, isolated, and facing the reality that her lover had never cared about her. Wade was unemployed, facing embezzlement charges, and completely discredited. But Cameron wasn't finished. The foundation had been laid, the pressure applied, and the structure was weakening. Now it was time for the controlled demolition. Chapter 6. The Setup. Spring arrived with Cameron's revenge entering its final phase. The legal machinery he'd set in motion was working perfectly, but he wanted something more personal, more definitive. He wanted each of his enemies to understand exactly why they were suffering and who was responsible. The Riverside Apartments had become more than just a real estate investment. It was the centerpiece of Cameron's community. He'd hired several of Wade's former victims, provided job training through his construction company, and created a model of ethical business practices that served as a living rebuke to Wade's predatory methods. Stacy was thriving in their new life. She'd made friends, her grades had improved dramatically, and the spark that Muhammad's assault had dimmed was burning bright again. But she was also more serious now, more aware of the complexities of human nature. "Dad," she said one evening while they reviewed her high school applications, "are you going to tell me what you're really doing to them?" Cameron looked up from the paperwork. "What do you mean? I'm not stupid. Grandpa Muhammad getting evicted right after you bought that apartment building. Wade losing his job right after you started your real estate thing. Mom getting abandoned right when she needs Wade most. That's not coincidence." Cameron studied his daughter, seeing himself in her analytical mind. "What do you think I should tell you?" "The truth. I'm old enough to understand that sometimes people have to face consequences for their actions. And if those consequences are extensive..." Stacy was quiet for a long moment. "Did they show mercy when they hurt me?" "No." "Then why should you show them mercy now?" Cameron felt a mix of pride and concern. Stacy was developing into a formidable young woman, but he didn't want his quest for justice to poison her view of the world. "Some people believe in forgiveness, sweetheart, in second chances. Some people deserve them," Stacy replied. "But some people use forgiveness as permission to keep hurting others." Her words crystallized as something Cameron had been feeling but hadn't articulated. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about preventing future victims. The final phase required precision, timing, and careful coordination. Cameron had spent months positioning all the pieces, and now he was ready to trigger the cascade that would bring down everyone who'd wronged his family. Muhammad's criminal trial was scheduled for next month, but Cameron had arranged for something more immediate. Using his construction connections, he learned that Muhammad frequented Murphy's tavern every afternoon, where he held court among other aging men who appreciated his old-school approach to discipline. What Muhammad didn't know was that several of these men had children and grandchildren who'd become concerned about his increasingly violent rhetoric. Cameron had Harvey discreetly share Muhammad's history with a few key fathers in the group, men who took a dim view of child abusers. "Word is that Muhammad won't be welcome at Murphy's much longer," Harvey reported. "Turns out construction workers don't like men who hit kids with bricks." Wade's situation was even more precarious. The embezzlement investigation had uncovered evidence that would likely result in federal charges. His former business partners were cooperating with authorities to minimize their own exposure, providing a detailed picture of Wade's fraudulent activities. But Cameron had one more surprise for Wade. Through Rex's investigation, they discovered that Wade had been claiming multiple primary residences for tax purposes, a form of fraud that the IRS took very seriously. Cameron arranged for this information to reach federal tax investigators anonymously. "He's looking at 5 to 7 years minimum," Rex reported, "and the IRS will seize all his assets to cover back taxes and penalties." Michelle presented a different challenge. Her cooperation in the divorce had been minimal, but she was ultimately just a victim of her own poor choices rather than an active predator. Cameron's revenge against her was more psychological, watching the complete collapse of the fantasy life she'd constructed with Wade. The masterstroke came when Cameron arranged for Michelle to discover exactly how thoroughly Wade had manipulated her. Harvey had obtained recordings of Wade's conversations with his gambling buddies, where he'd mocked Michelle as desperate trailer trash trying to climb the social ladder, and bragged about using her to hide his embezzlement. "The bitch thinks I'm going to marry her," Wade had laughed on one recording. "I just need her to keep covering for my alibis until I can move the last of the money offshore." Cameron had the recordings delivered to Michelle anonymously, along with copies of Wade's financial records showing that he'd spent her loan money on gambling debts and other women. The psychological impact was devastating. Michelle had sacrificed her marriage, her daughter's trust, and her family's stability for a man who'd seen her as nothing more than a useful fool. But Cameron's final gambit was the most elaborate. He'd arranged for all three of his enemies to be in the same place at the same time, under circumstances that would force them to confront not just their crimes, but each other. The setting was perfect, a community meeting about neighborhood safety, ostensibly organized by concerned residents, but actually orchestrated by Cameron through Rosa, Spaulding, and his other tenant allies. Muhammad would be there because he'd been specifically invited as a community elder whose input was valued. He'd attend because his ego demanded it, especially given his current social isolation. Wade would be there because he'd receive an anonymous tip that his former business partners were planning to attend and make public statements about his embezzlement. He'd come to try to control the narrative. Michelle would be there because she'd been told that Stacy was planning to make a public statement about family violence, and that her presence as a supportive mother would help her custody case. None of them knew the others would be there. None of them knew Cameron was behind the meeting, and none of them were prepared for what was about to happen. As Cameron made final preparations for the confrontation, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. 18 months ago, he'd been a trusting husband and father who believed in the fundamental goodness of people. Now he was something else entirely, a man who'd learned that sometimes justice required more than legal proceedings. Tomorrow night, at Roosevelt Elementary School's community room, Cameron Anderson would finally reveal himself as the architect of their destruction, and he would give each of them exactly what they'd given his daughter: no mercy, no forgiveness, and no second chances. The foundation was complete. The structure was weakening, and Cameron was ready to push the button that would bring it all down. Chapter 7. The Confrontation. The Roosevelt Elementary School community room buzzed with an unusual tension as nearly 50 residents gathered for what they believed was a routine neighborhood safety meeting. Cameron arrived early, positioning himself in the back where he could observe without being immediately noticed. He watched with cold satisfaction as his targets entered separately, each unaware they were walking into a carefully orchestrated trap. Muhammad arrived first, dressed in his best shirt and carrying himself with the false authority of a man who'd spent decades bullying others into submission. He took a seat near the front, immediately beginning to hold court with anyone who'd listen about the decline of discipline in modern society. Wade slipped in 10 minutes later, clearly agitated and constantly checking his phone. He'd lost weight since the embezzlement scandal broke, and his usual polished appearance had been replaced by the haggard look of a man under federal investigation. Michelle was the last to arrive, scanning the room frantically for Stacy before realizing her daughter wasn't there. Her confusion turned to alarm when she spotted both Muhammad and Wade, but before she could leave, the meeting began. Rosa Spaulding, who'd become Cameron's unwitting ally, called for attention. "Thank you all for coming tonight. We've gathered to discuss community safety, particularly the protection of children from violence and exploitation." Muhammad shifted uncomfortably, but still didn't understand what was happening. "We've invited several community members to share their experiences," Rosa continued. "First, I'd like to introduce Krista Hurst, a pediatric nurse who has something important to tell us." Krista approached the microphone with the confidence of someone who'd spent years advocating for abused children. Her presentation was devastating, a detailed account of Muhammad's assault on her 8-year-old son 20 years ago, complete with medical records and photographs. "This man," she said, pointing directly at Muhammad, "broke my child's ribs with a garden hoe for the crime of retrieving a ball from his yard. He threatened my family when we considered pressing charges, and he's continued this pattern of violence for decades." Muhammad's face turned red. "This is slander. I never—" "Shut up," said a voice from the audience. Cameron recognized him as Joey Levine, a construction foreman whose crew had worked on several of Cameron's projects. "Let her finish." Krista continued, describing not just the physical assault, but the years of intimidation that followed. The room's mood shifted palpably as parents realized they were sitting next to a predator who'd terrorized children for decades. Next came Jamie Middleton, Muhammad's nephew, who described his own disciplined sessions with clinical precision. The broken arm when he was 14, the concussion from being thrown downstairs at 16, the psychological damage that had taken years of therapy to address. My uncle taught me that violence was normal, Jamie said quietly, that children were property to be controlled through fear. It took me 20 years to understand that what happened to me was criminal. Muhammad stood to leave, but found his path blocked by several large men who'd positioned themselves strategically around the room. He wasn't technically being detained, but the message was clear. Now, Rosa said, let's discuss another form of predatory behavior that's affected our community. Rex Lamb is here to explain how certain real estate developers have systematically exploited vulnerable families. Rex's presentation was equally thorough, detailing Wade's foreclosure scheme with charts, graphs, and testimonials for victims. He explained how Wade had deliberately targeted single mothers, elderly residents, and immigrants who didn't understand their rights. Wade tried to interrupt. This is character assassination. I've never been convicted of. Because you targeted people who couldn't fight back, interrupted another voice. This time it was Abraham Andrews, a legal aid lawyer who'd been working with Wade's victims. Until now, Abraham detailed the pending criminal charges, the civil lawsuits, and the federal investigation into Wade's embezzlement. He also revealed Wade's tax fraud, explaining how he'd stolen not just from his company, but from every taxpayer in the country. Mr. Willis is looking at significant federal prison time, Abraham concluded. But more importantly, his victims are finally getting justice. Wade was pale and shaking, realizing that his crimes were now public knowledge in the community where he'd planned to rebuild his reputation. Finally, Rosa called for the evening's main presenter. Cameron Anderson has something to share about how these forms of abuse intersect and affect real families. Cameron walked to the front of the room, savoring the moment when Muhammad, Wade, and Michelle finally understood who was behind their systematic destruction. 18 months ago, Cameron began, his voice carrying clearly through the silent room. Muhammad Underwood assaulted my 13-year-old daughter with a brick, breaking her nose and splitting her lip. He did this because she'd gotten a B+ in math instead of an A. The room erupted in angry murmurs, but Cameron continued. My wife Michelle laughed when it happened. She told my bleeding, terrified daughter that she was pathetic and needed to learn respect. Michelle stood up, trembling. Cameron, don't do this. Sit down, commanded a woman's voice. It was Suzanne Underwood, who'd entered quietly during Rex's presentation. For once in your miserable life, Michelle, listen to what you've done. The room fell silent as Suzanne approached the microphone. Cameron stepped aside, understanding that this moment belonged to her. I'm Suzanne Underwood, she said, her voice stronger than Cameron had ever heard it. Muhammad is my husband, and Michelle is my daughter. And I'm here to tell you what kind of monsters they really are. What followed was 40 years of suppressed truth. Suzanne played audio recordings of Muhammad's violent rages, his threats, his admissions of past assaults. She described decades of abuse, not just against herself, but against anyone weaker than him. I enabled this, she admitted, tears streaming down her face. I told myself I was protecting my family, but I was really just protecting a monster. And when he assaulted Cameron's daughter, my own granddaughter, I asked for beer instead of calling an ambulance. Michelle tried to speak, but Suzanne cut her off. You want to defend yourself? Then explain why you laughed when your daughter was bleeding. Explain why you chose a criminal like Wade Willis over your own child's safety. Cameron had one final revelation. He played the recording of Wade mocking Michelle to his gambling buddies, describing her as desperate trailer trash and bragging about using her to hide his crimes. This is the man you sacrificed your family for, Cameron told Michelle, a con artist who saw you as a useful fool. The meeting continued for another hour, with community members sharing their own experiences with neighborhood predators and discussing concrete steps for protection. But the real business was finished. Muhammad sat in stunned silence, finally understanding that his decades of violence had consequences. Wade was taking frantic phone calls from lawyers, trying to minimize the damage of his public exposure. Michelle had collapsed into tears, the full weight of her choices finally hitting her. As the meeting ended and people filed out, several community members approached Cameron to express their support. But Cameron's attention was focused on his three enemies, each now isolated and facing the ruins of their lives. "You destroyed us," Michelle whispered as she passed him. "No," Cameron replied calmly. "You destroyed yourselves. I just made sure everyone could see what you really are." The confrontation was over, but Cameron's revenge was just entering its final phase. Tomorrow, the legal and social consequences would begin in earnest. And Cameron Anderson would watch with cold satisfaction as each of them faced exactly what they deserved. Chapter 8. The Reckoning. The morning after the community meeting, Cameron's phone rang constantly. News of the confrontation had spread throughout the neighborhood and beyond, with social media amplifying the story of a father's methodical pursuit of justice. Local news stations picked up the story, focusing on the unusual public revelation of decades-old crimes and the systematic nature of Cameron's response. The headlines varied, but the narrative was consistent. Father's calculated revenge exposes pattern of abuse and fraud. Muhammad was the first to fall completely. The combination of new assault charges, decades-old cases being reopened, and complete social ostracism created a perfect storm. But Cameron had one final blow waiting. Harvey called with the news: Muhammad's in custody. Bail was denied. On what grounds? Flight risk and public safety. Turns out when you have recordings of someone bragging about assaulting children, judges take it seriously. Plus, 3 more families came forward after last night's meeting. The eviction had proceeded as scheduled, but Muhammad wouldn't need housing where he was going. His court-appointed lawyer was already discussing plea bargains, knowing that fighting the charges would result in even harsher sentencing. Wade's collapse was more dramatic. The embezzlement charges had been upgraded to federal racketeering charges as investigators discovered his operation was larger than initially suspected. His real estate license was revoked, his assets were frozen, and his former associates were distancing themselves completely. But the most satisfying development came from an unexpected source: Wade's ex-wife, Brandy Gamble Willis. "Mr. Anderson," she said when she called Cameron directly, "I wanted to thank you for exposing Wade's true nature. I've been trying to prove his financial abuse for years, but I never had the resources to investigate properly." "What do you mean?" "Wade has been hiding assets from our divorce settlement and avoiding child support payments. The evidence your investigation uncovered proves he's been lying about his income for years. My children will finally get what they're owed." Wade was facing not just federal prison time, but additional civil liability that would consume any remaining assets. He would emerge from prison as broke as the families he'd victimized. Michelle's situation was more complex. Unlike Muhammad and Wade, her primary crime was moral rather than criminal. But Cameron had ensured that the consequences would be lasting and appropriate. The custody hearing was a formality. Michelle's recorded laughter during Stacy's assault, combined with her documented abandonment of parental responsibilities during the crisis, resulted in a complete termination of parental rights. "Your Honor," Michelle's lawyer had argued desperately, "my client was in shock, not thinking clearly. Your client found the assault of her child amusing enough to laugh about." The judge responded coldly. She then called that same child pathetic and told her to respect her attacker. This isn't poor judgment. It's a fundamental failure of maternal instinct. But Cameron's final move against Michelle was more personal. He'd purchased the small house she'd rented after the divorce, the same strategy he'd used against Muhammad. But instead of immediate eviction, he offered her a choice. "You can stay in the house," Cameron told her during their last face-to-face conversation. "Rent-free, utilities paid, modest living allowance." Michelle's eyes filled with hope. "Really? There are conditions. You'll attend mandatory therapy sessions for personality disorders. You'll perform community service, specifically helping victims of child abuse. And you'll live with a recorded statement from Stacy playing once every evening at dinner time." "What statement?" Cameron played a recording of their daughter's testimony from the custody hearing, where Stacy had described in heartbreaking detail how her mother's laughter had hurt more than her grandfather's violence. Every evening, you'll listen to your daughter explain how your choices affected her. You'll remember what you chose over her welfare, and you'll live with that knowledge for as long as you stay in this house. Michelle's face crumpled. That's torture. That's consequences. The alternative is homelessness and complete social isolation. Your choice. She chose the house, as Cameron had known she would. Michelle had never been strong enough to face the full consequences of her actions. The legal machinery continued grinding forward over the following months. Muhammad was sentenced to 8 years in state prison, with additional civil liability that would consume any future assets. His health problems, exacerbated by stress and age, made it unlikely he'd survive his full sentence. Wade received 12 years in federal prison for racketeering, tax evasion, and wire fraud. The judge had been particularly harsh in sentencing, noting that Wade had preyed on vulnerable families during times of economic distress. Suzanne had relocated to a small apartment near the Riverside complex, where she volunteered at a domestic violence shelter and attended support groups for abuse survivors. She'd also become a regular visitor to Stacy, attempting to rebuild a relationship with her granddaughter based on honesty and accountability. "I can't undo 40 years of cowardice," Suzanne told Cameron during one of their supervised visits. "But maybe I can show Stacy that people can change when they finally face the truth." Cameron approved of the relationship cautiously. Suzanne's transformation seemed genuine, and Stacy needed to understand that redemption was possible for those willing to do the difficult work of change. As winter approached, Cameron reflected on the year of systematic revenge. Muhammad, Wade, and Michelle had each faced consequences perfectly tailored to their crimes. But more importantly, their capacity to hurt others had been permanently eliminated. Muhammad would die in prison, remembered as a child abuser rather than a respected elder. Wade would emerge from federal prison as a broken man with no resources and no reputation. Michelle would live in comfortable isolation, reminded daily of her moral failures. The community was safer. Future victims had been protected, and justice had been served not through legal technicalities or plea bargains, but through the methodical application of consequences. That evening, as Cameron helped Stacy with her homework in their apartment overlooking the Riverside complex, he felt something he hadn't experienced in over a year: peace. "Dad," Stacy said, looking up from her algebra textbook, "do you think you'll ever forgive him?" Cameron considered the question carefully. "Forgiveness isn't about them, sweetheart. It's about whether holding on to anger serves any useful purpose. Does it? Not anymore. They can't hurt anyone else now. That was always the point." Stacy nodded, satisfied with the explanation. At 15, she understood justice in ways that would serve her well in life. But Cameron's peace was about to be tested one final time. Because even the most carefully planned revenge could have unexpected consequences, and some enemies refused to accept defeat gracefully. Chapter 9. The Final Victory. 6 months after the sentences were handed down, Cameron thought his war was over. Muhammad was in maximum security, Wade was beginning his federal sentence, and Michelle was living her carefully constructed purgatory. The Riverside Apartments had become a model community. Stacy was thriving in high school, and Cameron had even begun dating again, a kind woman named Rosemary Ayers who worked as a victim's advocate. But Cameron had underestimated the depth of Michelle's narcissism and her capacity for self-destruction. It started with phone calls to Stacy's school, claiming to be a concerned relative reporting parental alienation. When that failed, Michelle began following Stacy and her friends, taking photographs and making notes about their activities. She convinced herself that documenting Cameron's controlling behavior would help her regain custody. The breaking point came when Michelle violated the restraining order by approaching Stacy directly outside school. "Sweetheart," Michelle said, grabbing Stacy's arm as she walked toward Cameron's truck, "you don't understand what your father has done to our family. He's poisoned you against me, destroyed everything we had." Stacy pulled away firmly. "You destroyed everything when you laughed while I was bleeding. I was in shock. I didn't know how to react. You call me pathetic. You told me to respect the man who broke my nose. Other students had gathered, filming the confrontation on their phones. Michelle realized she was being recorded and became more desperate. He's turned you against your own mother. That's abuse, Stacy. He's abusing you by keeping us apart. Stacy's response was calm, mature, and devastating. The only abuse I remember is Grandpa hitting me with a brick while you laughed. Everything else has been people protecting me from you. The video went viral within hours, with hashtag #StacyStrong trending as people shared their support for a teenager who'd articulated the difference between justice and abuse better than most adults. But Michelle's humiliation drove her to an even more desperate act. She'd somehow obtained Wade's prison phone privileges and convinced him to help her with one final scheme. Wade, facing his own complete destruction, was receptive to any plan that might create leverage for appeals or reduce sentences. Together, they concocted a narrative that Cameron had orchestrated their downfall through illegal surveillance, witness intimidation, and conspiracy. The plan was to claim that Cameron's investigation had violated their civil rights, potentially creating grounds for overturning their convictions or pursuing federal civil rights charges against him. They'd underestimated Cameron's thoroughness once again. Harvey called with a warning. Michelle's been meeting with a civil rights attorney, claiming you violated federal wiretapping laws and conspired to deny them due process. Any merit to the claims? None. Every recording was legal, every investigation was properly conducted, and everything we did was within your rights as a private citizen protecting your child. But they might cause trouble. Cameron's response was swift and decisive. He'd anticipated this possibility and prepared for it months ago. The next morning, Cameron held a press conference outside the courthouse where Muhammad and Wade had been sentenced. He was joined by Rosa Spalding, Krista Hurst, Jamie Middleton, and a dozen other victims and community advocates. Michelle Anderson and Wade Willis are attempting to portray themselves as victims of some conspiracy, Cameron announced to the gathered media. Let me be clear about what actually happened. Cameron systematically destroyed their narrative, presenting a timeline of events with supporting documentation. Every action he'd taken was legal. Every consequence was proportional, and every revelation was based on verified evidence. A man assaulted my daughter with a brick. My wife laughed about it. Her lover embezzled money to finance their affair. These are facts, not conspiracies. But Cameron's masterstroke was revealing that he'd anticipated this exact response and documented Michelle's violation of the restraining order, her stalking behavior, and her attempts to manipulate Wade from prison. Michelle Anderson has spent the past 6 months proving that she learned nothing from the consequences of her actions. She continues to prioritize her own ego over her daughter's welfare, and she's willing to ally with a convicted felon to avoid accountability. The civil rights attorney withdrew from Michelle's case within 24 hours, realizing that pursuing it would only generate more negative publicity for his firm. Wade's attempt to leverage the situation for a reduced sentence backfired spectacularly when prison officials discovered he'd been using his phone privileges to coordinate harassment of a minor. His prison conditions became significantly more restrictive. Michelle made one final desperate play, attempting to contact Stacy directly through social media with messages claiming Cameron had brainwashed her and promising to rescue her from his control. Stacy's response was to screenshot the messages and post them publicly with a caption. This is what emotional abuse looks like. A woman who still thinks her daughter owes her love after she laughed at her pain. The post received thousands of supportive responses and effectively ended any public sympathy for Michelle's situation. That evening, as Cameron reviewed the week's events with Stacy, he realized that his daughter had learned the most important lesson of all: how to protect herself from people who would exploit her kindness. "Are you proud of what you did, Dad?" Stacy asked. Cameron considered the question carefully. "I'm proud that I protected you. I'm proud that I stopped them from hurting other people. I'm proud that you learned to stand up for yourself. But are you proud of destroying them? They destroyed themselves, sweetheart. I just made sure everyone could see the truth." A year later, Cameron stood in the community garden behind the Riverside Apartments, watching Stacy teach younger children how to plant vegetables. The space had been created through a partnership between his construction company and local schools, providing job training and community improvement simultaneously. Muhammad had died in prison 6 months earlier, his health broken by stress and age. Wade was serving his sentence in relative isolation, having exhausted his appeals and alienated his remaining family members. Michelle continued living in Cameron's house, listening to her daughter's testimony each evening and volunteering at the abuse shelter as required. Some might call it cruel, but Cameron saw it as perfect justice. Each person living with the exact consequences of their choices, unable to hurt others, forced to confront their true nature daily. Rosemary joined him in the garden, taking his hand as they watched Stacy demonstrate patience and kindness with children who reminded Cameron of himself years ago. Good people who believed in the fundamental decency of others. Any regrets? Rosemary asked, understanding the weight of what Cameron had done. Cameron watched his daughter laugh with her students, confident and strong and completely safe from the people who'd once threatened her happiness. None, he said finally. Some people choose to be predators. When they do, they forfeit their right to mercy. The war was over. The victims were protected. And Cameron Anderson had proven that sometimes the only way to stop monsters was to become something more ruthless than they were. But unlike them, he'd never forgotten the difference between justice and cruelty, between protection and revenge, between necessary hardness and unnecessary brutality. In the end, that had made all the difference. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there. Welcome back to another episode of Infidelity Tales Lab. We're thankful for your continued viewership. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? We love knowing our global reach. Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Wedding Day Silence. Derek Thornfield adjusted his tie one final time as he stood at the altar of St. Matthew's Cathedral. At 34, he was a man who commanded respect. 6'2", with steel-gray eyes that had seen the ugliness of war during his military service and later the cutthroat world of private security consulting. His company, Apex Protection Services, had made him wealthy by keeping dangerous secrets for dangerous people. The organ began playing, and Chloe appeared at the end of the aisle. 28 years old, with auburn hair and emerald eyes, she looked ethereal in her flowing white gown. They had met 2 years ago at a charity gala, where she worked as an event coordinator. Her laugh had captivated him, her seeming innocence a balm to his hardened soul. But today something was wrong. Chloe walked down the aisle mechanically, her face pale and expressionless. When she reached him, Derek searched her eyes for the warmth he'd fallen in love with. Instead, he found something cold and distant. The ceremony proceeded with painful stiffness. Chloe's responses to the officiant were barely audible whispers. When it came time for their personal vows, she simply nodded when asked if she took Derek to be her husband. No smile, no tears of joy, nothing. Derek felt the eyes of 200 guests burning into them. His military buddies, her family from Portland, their mutual friends, all witnessing this bizarre pantomime. His mother, Margaret Thornfield, sat in the front row with worry etched across her weathered face. "What's wrong? Why won't you talk?" Derek whispered urgently during the ring exchange, but Chloe just stared ahead in silence, her hands trembling as she slipped the band onto his finger. The reception at the grand ballroom was a surreal nightmare. Chloe sat beside him at the head table like a beautiful mannequin, mechanically cutting their wedding cake, forcing smiles for photos, but never speaking. When guests approached to congratulate them, Derek found himself making excuses. "She's just overwhelmed. Wedding nerves. She's feeling a bit under the weather." Brett Morrison, Derek's former Army buddy and current business partner, leaned over during dinner. "Brother, what the hell is going on with your wife? She looks like she's at a funeral, not her wedding." Derek's jaw tightened. Brett was right. Something was seriously wrong, but he had no answers. Around 9 o'clock, Chloe excused herself to the restroom. As Derek watched her go, a young waitress with short blonde hair approached his table. She looked nervous, glancing around before slipping him a small folded piece of paper. "Sir, someone asked me to give this to you," she said quickly before hurrying away. Derek unfolded the note with growing dread. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the words hit him like a sledgehammer. "Your wife has been lying to you for 8 months. She's been having an affair with your business partner, Brett Morrison. They planned this wedding as the perfect cover. She's pregnant with his child, not yours. She wanted to back out today, but Brett threatened to tell you everything and destroy her reputation if she didn't go through with it. She's trapped, and now so are you. Check her phone. Password is your anniversary date from when you first met. I couldn't stand watching this anymore. A friend." Derek's vision blurred. His hands began to shake as the words sank in. The noise of the reception faded to a dull roar in his ears. He looked across the room at Brett, who was laughing loudly with some of Derek's army buddies, a beer in his hand, playing the role of the loyal best man. 8 months. They had been engaged for exactly 8 months. Everything clicked into place with sickening clarity. Chloe's recent distance, her mysterious doctor appointments she claimed were for wedding stress, Brett's increased interest in their business finances, the way they both seemed to avoid being in the same room together lately. It wasn't avoidance. It was guilty conscience. Derek stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Several guests looked his way, but he was already moving toward the exit, the note crumpled in his fist. His mind, trained by years of military strategy and security planning, was already shifting into tactical mode. Derek Thornfield had built his reputation on never leaving an enemy standing. Tonight, he had discovered he'd been sharing his bed with 2 of them. Chapter 2, The Discovery. Derek drove through the empty streets of downtown Portland, his hands gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles went white. He pulled into the parking garage of his high-rise apartment building, the one he'd planned to sell after the honeymoon, since he and Chloe were supposed to move into their new house in the suburbs. In his study, Derek opened his laptop and began doing what he did best, gathering intelligence. His military background and current profession had taught him that information was the deadliest weapon of all. First, he accessed the security footage from his office building. As the owner of Apex Protection Services, Derek had state-of-the-art surveillance systems. He scrolled through weeks of footage, his stomach churning as he watched Brett and Chloe's secret meetings in Derek's own conference room. There they were, embracing passionately, her hand on her still flat stomach, Brett's mouth against her neck. The timestamp showed their affair had started exactly 8 months ago, right after Derek had proposed to Chloe at their favorite restaurant. Derek's phone buzzed with texts from concerned wedding guests, but he ignored them all. He had work to do. Next, he hacked into Chloe's phone remotely, a skill he'd learned from his cybersecurity contacts. The password worked exactly as the note predicted. What he found made his blood run cold. Text after text between Chloe and Brett. "Brett, just get through the ceremony. We'll figure out the rest later. Chloe, I can't do this to him. Derek loves me. Brett, you should have thought about that before you spread your legs for me. You're having him wide, baby. If you don't marry him, I'll tell him everything and make sure everyone knows what a whore you are. Your precious reputation will be destroyed. Chloe, I hate you for this. Brett, you didn't hate me last night when you were screaming my name." Derek's hands clenched into fists, but it got worse. He found messages between Brett and someone named Tony Vega, a name Derek recognized from his criminal background checks. Tony was a loan shark who Brett apparently owed serious money to. Gambling debts, from the looks of it. "Tony, you better have my money by the end of the month. Morrison, or you're going to be eating through a straw. Brett, don't worry. I'm about to become business partners with my buddy Derek. His company is worth millions. I'll have your money plus interest. Tony, how are you going to manage that? Brett, let's just say I've got some leverage over him. He's marrying my baby mama tomorrow, but he doesn't know it. Once I control half his business through his wife, you'll get paid." Derek leaned back in his chair, a cold smile spreading across his face. So that was the real game. Brett hadn't just stolen his woman. He'd planned to steal his life's work too. Chloe was just a pawn in Brett's scheme to take over Derek's company and pay off his debts. Derek pulled up Brett's file from his secure server. As his business partner, Derek had done extensive background checks on him. Brett Morrison, 32, from Seattle. Former Army Ranger, discharged for conduct issues Derek had never fully investigated. Divorced, with a string of failed relationships and mounting debt problems Derek hadn't known about. But Derek also had something Brett didn't know about: leverage that went far beyond business partnerships. 2 years ago, Derek had been hired by a government contractor to provide security for a classified operation in Afghanistan. Brett had been part of the team, and Derek had covered up a serious incident where Brett had violated the rules of engagement, resulting in civilian casualties. Derek had destroyed the evidence and official reports to protect Brett's career and their unit's reputation. Brett thought that secret died in the desert. He was wrong. Derek made a series of phone calls to his contacts, people in dark corners of the intelligence world who owed him favors. By morning, he would have everything he needed to destroy both Brett and Chloe completely. His phone rang. Chloe's name appeared on the screen. Derek. Her voice was small, scared. Where did you go? Everyone's asking. I know, Derek said quietly. Silence stretched between them. Derek, I can explain. Can you explain whose baby you're carrying? He heard her sharp intake of breath, then the sound of her crying. I'm coming home, she whispered. No, Derek said, his voice like ice. You're not. This isn't your home anymore. It never was. He hung up and removed the battery from his phone. Derek Thornfield was done being the victim. Tomorrow, the war would begin. Chapter 3, The Setup. Derek spent the night in his study, making preparations with the methodical precision of a military operation. By dawn, he had assembled a comprehensive dossier on both targets and formulated a strategy that would destroy them systematically. His first call was to his lawyer, Patricia Hawkins, who specialized in high-stakes corporate litigation. Derek, congratulations on the wedding. Patricia, I need an emergency annulment. Tonight's wedding was obtained through fraud. I have evidence my wife has been having an affair and is pregnant with another man's child. Patricia was quiet for a moment. That's certainly grounds for annulment in Oregon. I can have the papers filed by Monday. Good, but that's just the beginning. I need you to prepare a hostile takeover of my own company. I'm sorry, what? Derek explained the partnership structure of Apex Protection Services. While Derek owned 60%, Brett held 40% as a founding partner. However, Derek had discovered that Brett had been using his shares as collateral for his gambling debts without Derek's knowledge, a violation of their partnership agreement. If Brett has pledged his shares illegally, I can void his partnership and buy back his stake for pennies on the dollar, Patricia confirmed. But Derek, are you sure you want to? I want him financially ruined, Derek interrupted. Completely destroyed. Can you do it? Yes, but... Then do it. I'll transfer the evidence to your secure server within the hour. Derek's second call was to Marcus Webb, a former CIA operative who now ran a private investigation firm. Marcus had been Derek's commanding officer in Afghanistan and knew about Brett's covered-up incident. Derek, my boy, how was the wedding? Marcus, I need a favor. Remember that situation with Brett Morrison in Kandahar? The line went quiet. What about it? I need the real files. All of them. Derek, that's dangerous territory. If that comes to light, Brett Morrison is trying to destroy my life. He's been having an affair with my wife and planned to steal my company. The civilian casualties in Kandahar weren't collateral damage. They were murder. I covered for him, and now he's repaying that loyalty by betraying me. Marcus sighed. I'll have the files to you by tonight. But Derek, once this door opens, there's no closing it. Good. I want it wide open. Derek's third call was to someone who didn't officially exist. Gabriel Stone was a problem solver for people with serious money and serious problems. Derek had met him through his government security work, and Gabriel had a talent for making inconvenient situations disappear or making inconvenient people disappear. Mr. Thornfield, Gabriel's cultured voice came through an encrypted line. I heard congratulations are in order. Actually, I need your services. 2 targets. I want them broken, not dead. At least not yet. Financial, personal, physical, all of the above. I want them to lose everything that matters to them, slowly and painfully. And I want them to know it's coming from me. Interesting. Send me the details. My rate is... Money isn't an object. I want creativity. I want them to suffer the way they made me suffer. Understood. I'll be in touch. By noon, Derek had received confirmation that his trap was set. Patricia was filing the annulment papers and the corporate takeover documents. Marcus had delivered Brett's classified military files. Gabriel had provided a detailed psychological profile of both targets and recommended a course of action that would systematically destroy every aspect of their lives. Derek's phone had 17 missed calls from Chloe and 12 from Brett. He ignored them all. Instead, he drove to his office building. In the lobby, he instructed security to revoke Brett Morrison's access cards immediately. Then he took the elevator to the 15th floor, where Apex Protection Services occupied the entire level. Derek's assistant, Jennifer Ross, looked up in surprise. "Mr. Thornfield, I didn't expect to see you today. How was the wedding?" "Canceled," Derek said simply. "Jennifer, I need you to call an emergency board meeting for this afternoon. All department heads, plus our major clients. And I need you to contact our military contract officer at the Pentagon. Tell him I have urgent information regarding a compromised operative." Jennifer's eyes widened, but she'd worked for Derek long enough to know not to ask questions. Derek walked into his corner office and stood at the window, looking down at the city below. Somewhere out there, Brett Morrison was probably celebrating his successful deception. Somewhere else, Chloe was probably crying and trying to figure out how to salvage her situation. They had no idea what was coming. Derek opened his desk drawer and pulled out a framed photo of him and Chloe from their engagement party. She was laughing in the picture, her head thrown back in joy, her hand displaying her engagement ring. He studied her face, looking for signs of the deception he'd missed. Then he dropped the frame into his wastebasket, glass shattering as it hit the bottom. Derek Thornfield was a patient man, but his patience had limits. Brett Morrison and Chloe Reynolds had crossed a line from which there would be no return. They wanted to play games with his life. He'd show them what real games looked like. The war was about to begin, and Derek had no intention of taking prisoners. Chapter 4. The First Strike. Monday morning arrived with gray Portland skies that matched Derek's mood perfectly. He sat in the conference room of Hawkins & Associates, watching Patricia spread documents across the mahogany table like battle plans. "The annulment papers have been filed," Patricia said, adjusting her glasses. "Based on the evidence you provided, the affair, the pregnancy, the fraudulent concealment, the judge will likely grant it within 30 days. Oregon is very clear about marriages obtained through deception." Derek nodded grimly. "What about the business? Brett Morrison violated Section 12 of your partnership agreement by using his shares as collateral without written consent. Under Oregon business law, that constitutes automatic forfeiture of his partnership stake. I filed an emergency motion to freeze his assets and force a sale of his shares back to the company at the original valuation price from 5 years ago, which is approximately $40,000. His current stake is worth about $2.8 million. Derek's smile was predatory. "Perfect. When will he be served?" "This afternoon." "But Derek, you should know. He's been calling my office all morning. He knows something is happening." Derek's phone buzzed with another call from Brett. He'd received 23 calls in the past 2 days, along with increasingly desperate voicemails. He declined the call and turned back to Patricia. Let him panic. "What about the criminal matter?" Patricia's expression grew serious. "That's more complicated. Marcus delivered the Afghanistan files, and they're damning. Brett Morrison violated the Geneva Convention and committed war crimes. However, pursuing this criminally could expose your own role in the cover-up. I'm prepared for that risk. Derek, you could face federal charges. Court-martial. Prison time." Derek leaned back in his chair, considering. What if the information were to surface through different channels? Anonymous tips to investigative journalists, for instance. Patricia understood immediately. That would be outside the scope of legal counsel I can provide. Of course. Moving on. What about the personal matter? Chloe Reynolds has been staying at the Marriott downtown since Saturday night. My investigator confirmed she's been meeting with Brett Morrison daily, presumably trying to coordinate their response to your actions. Derek's jaw tightened. Even now, they were still together. Still scheming. There's something else, Patricia continued. My investigator discovered that Chloe withdrew $30,000 from her savings account this morning. She also purchased a plane ticket to San Francisco, departing Friday. Running away? It appears so. But here's the interesting part. The ticket is one way, and it's in her maiden name only. Derek processed this information. Chloe was planning to disappear, probably hoping to start over somewhere else with Brett's baby. It was a smart move, but it wouldn't save her. Derek's phone rang. This time it was his office. Mr. Thornfield? Jennifer's voice was tense. Brett Morrison is here. He's demanding to see you, and he's agitated. Derek glanced at his watch. 2:15 p.m. Perfect timing. Send him up to conference room B. Tell him I'll be there in 5 minutes. He ended the call and turned to Patricia. I need you to be a witness to this conversation. Bring a recording device. Derek, I don't think. Patricia, in 5 minutes, Brett Morrison is going to confess to fraud, conspiracy, and probably threaten me. I need it documented. They walked to Derek's office, building in silence. In the elevator, Derek felt the familiar calm that had always preceded combat operations. His heartbeat slowed, his breathing steadied, his mind sharpened to a laser focus. Brett Morrison was pacing like a caged animal when Derek entered conference room B. At 32, Brett was still military fit, but Derek could see stress eating at him. Dark circles under his eyes, a tremor in his hands, sweat stains on his shirt despite the cool weather. Derek, thank God. I've been trying to reach you for days. We need to talk. Derek sat down calmly, Patricia beside him with her briefcase. I'm listening. Brett glanced nervously at Patricia. This is private business. Ms. Hawkins is my attorney. Everything you say here is privileged. Now talk. Brett ran his hands through his hair. Look, I know you know about Chloe and me. Someone sent you something at the wedding, right? I saw you leave. Keep going. Derek, it's not what you think. She was vulnerable, confused about the engagement. I was helping her work through her feelings, and things just happened. It was a mistake. Derek's expression remained perfectly neutral. How many times did this mistake happen? What? 8 months, Brett. 8 months you've been fucking my fiancée behind my back. 8 months you've been coming to my home, eating my food, pretending to be my friend while you betrayed me. So tell me exactly how many times this mistake happened. Brett's face went pale. Derek, listen, and tell me about the baby. Is it mine or yours? The question hung in the air like a blade. Brett opened and closed his mouth several times before Derek continued. Tell me about your gambling debts. Tell me about Tony Vega. Tell me about your plan to steal my company to pay off your bookies. Brett stepped backward as if he'd been slapped. How did you? I know everything, Brett. Every text message. Every secret meeting. Every lie you've told me for the past 8 months. The only question now is whether you're going to keep lying or start telling the truth. Brett slumped into a chair, his facade crumbling. Derek, I'm in serious trouble. Tony Vega isn't just a bookie. He's connected to some very dangerous people. If I don't pay him back, that's not my problem anymore. Yes, it is. Brett's voice rose desperately. Don't you understand? If they kill me, they'll come after you too. You're my business partner. They'll assume you have my money. Derek smiled coldly. Actually, I'm not your business partner anymore. You violated our partnership agreement when you used your shares as collateral. As of this afternoon, you own exactly 0% of Apex Protection Services. Brett stared at him in horror. You can't do that. Already did. Check your phone. You should have received service papers about an hour ago. Brett fumbled for his phone with shaking hands. Derek watched his face crumble as he read the legal documents. This is insane. You can't just steal my company. I'm not stealing anything. You forfeited your rights when you committed fraud. The buyback price is $40,000, the original value of your stake, minus legal fees and damages, of course. Derek, please. I'm begging you. I made a mistake, but I'll make it right. Chloe means nothing to me. It was just sex. You and I are brothers. We served together. We've been through hell together. Derek stood slowly, his eyes never leaving Brett's face. You're right. We did serve together. We were brothers, which is why what you did is unforgivable. He started toward the door, then paused. Oh, and Brett, You might want to start looking for a new career. I'm sending some interesting files about your service record to a journalist friend at the Washington Post. Something about civilian casualties in Kandahar. I'm sure the Pentagon will be very interested in reopening that investigation. Brett's face went white with terror. Derek, no. You can't. If that comes out, you'll go to federal prison for war crimes. Yes, I know. But you'll go down too. You covered up. Derek turned back with a smile that would have frozen hellfire. Brett, I've been planning my exit strategy from the moment I decided to protect you. The difference between you and me is that I always think 3 moves ahead. He walked out, leaving Brett Morrison sitting alone in the conference room, staring at the ruins of his life. The first strike was complete, but Derek was just getting started. Chapter 5. Cornered Prey. Derek returned to his apartment that evening to find Chloe waiting in the lobby. She looked haggard, her usually perfect hair disheveled, her eyes red and swollen from crying. She was clutching a small overnight bag, and Derek noticed her hands were trembling. Derek, please. We need to talk. He walked past her toward the elevators without breaking stride. No, we don't. Derek, wait. She hurried after him, her heels clicking on the marble floor. I know you're angry, but let me explain. Explain what? That you've been fucking my business partner for 8 months? That you're pregnant with his child? That you plan to use our marriage to help him steal my company? Derek's voice was deadly quiet as they entered the elevator alone. Chloe's face crumpled. It's not what you think. It's exactly what I think. The elevator doors closed. I've seen every text message, Chloe. Every photo. Every detail of your little plan. There was no plan. It just happened. Derek turned to face her fully for the first time since the wedding. Tell me about Tony Vega. Chloe went pale. I don't know who that is. Try again. Tell me about Brett's gambling debts. Tell me about his plan to use your marriage to me as leverage to take over my company and pay off his bookies. Derek, I swear I didn't know. You knew enough to withdraw $30,000 from your savings account this morning. You knew enough to buy a one-way ticket to San Francisco. The elevator reached the 15th floor, Derek's penthouse. As the doors opened, Chloe grabbed his arm. Derek, please. I'm pregnant. I'm scared. I don't know what to do. Derek looked down at her hand on his arm, then back to her face. Whose baby is it? I don't know. Yes, you do. The timing makes it impossible to be mine. You've been taking birth control pills the entire time we've been together. I've seen them in your purse. The only time you stopped was 8 months ago, right around the time you started fucking Brett. Chloe began crying harder. Derek, I love you. I've always loved you. What happened with Brett was just what? A mistake? You've been making the same mistake for 8 months. Derek stepped out of the elevator. Find somewhere else to go, Chloe. You're not welcome here. Where am I supposed to go? I don't have any money. You ruined Brett. He can't help me. Derek turned back to her with cold eyes. That's not my problem anymore. As the elevator doors began to close, Chloe stuck her foot out to stop them. Derek, wait. There's something else you need to know. Something in her tone made Derek pause. What? Brett. He's not just involved with gambling. He's been selling information about your clients. Derek's blood went cold. What kind of information? Security details. Client names. I don't understand all of it, but he's been meeting with someone named Vincent Kozlov. They've been paying him for details about your government contracts. Derek grabbed Chloe's arm and pulled her into his apartment, slamming the door behind them. Tell me everything. Now. Vincent Kozlov was a name Derek knew well. A Russian arms dealer who operated through a network of shell companies. If Brett had been selling classified information to foreign operatives, it wasn't just betrayal, it was treason. Start from the beginning, Derek demanded. Everything you know. Chloe sank onto his couch, still crying. About 3 months ago, Brett started having meetings with this Russian man. He told me it was just business consulting, but I heard them talking once. The Russian was asking about your Pentagon contracts, your client list, security protocols for government facilities. What did Brett tell him? I don't know exactly, but I saw Brett photographing documents from your office. He said it was just copying files for backup, but now. Derek's mind raced. If Brett had been selling classified information, it explained how he'd been able to maintain his lifestyle despite massive gambling debts. It also meant Derek's company, and possibly Derek himself, We're now targets of a federal investigation. How long has this been going on? I think since before we started, before Brett and I. Chloe couldn't finish the sentence. Derek pulled out his secure phone and dialed a number. Marcus? It's Derek. I need an emergency meeting. We have a national security problem. He ended the call and turned back to Chloe. You're not going to San Francisco. What? You're coming with me. You're going to tell the FBI everything you know about Brett's activities with Kozlov. Derek, no. If I cooperate with the FBI, Brett will know I betrayed him. He'll hurt me. Brett is about to be arrested for treason. He won't be in a position to hurt anyone. Derek's secure line rang. Marcus Webb's voice was tense. Derek, we have a problem. I just got word from my Pentagon contacts. There's been a security breach involving your company. FBI counterintelligence is opening an investigation. You need to get ahead of this immediately. I know about the breach. I have a witness who can testify about Brett Morrison's activities with Vincent Kozlov. Jesus Christ. How deep does this go? I don't know yet, but I intend to find out. Can you arrange a meeting with the FBI? I'll make some calls. Derek, if Morrison has been selling classified information, anyone with access to those files could be considered suspect. That includes you. Derek looked at Chloe, who was listening with growing terror. Then we need to move fast. I want Morrison in federal custody before he has a chance to destroy evidence or disappear. Agreed. I'll have something set up within the hour. Derek ended the call and turned to Chloe. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to cooperate fully with federal investigators. You're going to tell them everything you know about Brett's activities. In exchange, you'll receive immunity from prosecution. What about us? Derek's expression was stone cold. There is no us. There never was. But if you help me destroy Brett Morrison completely, I might let you disappear quietly instead of ensuring you're prosecuted as an accomplice. Chloe nodded frantically. I'll do whatever you want. Good. Because Brett Morrison is about to learn what happens when someone betrays Derek Thornfield. And this time, there won't be any mercy. Derek walked to his safe and pulled out a thick file, his insurance policy against Brett that he'd maintained since Afghanistan. But now he wouldn't just be ending Brett's career. He'd be ending his freedom permanently. Some betrayals could never be forgiven. Some enemies could never be allowed to survive. Brett Morrison was about to discover that Derek Thornfield was far more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. Chapter 6. The Net Closes. The FBI field office in downtown Portland was a fortress of glass and steel that Derek had visited many times in his professional capacity. Today, however, he wasn't here as a security consultant. He was here as a witness to treason. Special Agent Catherine Reed, a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who specialized in counterintelligence, sat across from Derek and Chloe in a sterile interview room. Between them lay stacks of documents, photographs, and digital evidence that painted a damning picture of Brett Morrison's criminal activities. Mr. Thornfield, you're certain about the timeline of these meetings between Morrison and Kozlov? Agent Reed's voice was crisp, professional. Absolutely. My company's security footage shows Morrison accessing classified files after hours on 17 separate occasions over the past 3 months. Each access corresponded with bank deposits to an offshore account registered to a shell company controlled by Kozlov's organization. Derek slid a folder across the table. Those are the financial records my investigator obtained. Morrison received over $200,000 for selling sensitive information about Pentagon security protocols. Agent Reed studied the documents, her expression growing darker. Ms. Reynolds, you witnessed these meetings personally? Chloe nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. Brett told me they were just business consultations, but I heard them talking about military contracts, security weaknesses at government facilities. The Russian man, Kozlov, he was very specific about what information he wanted. Can you identify Kozlov from photographs? Yes. I saw him 3 times at Brett's apartment. Agent Reed made notes on her legal pad. Mr. Thornfield, I need to ask, why didn't you report these suspicions earlier? Derek's jaw tightened. Because until 3 days ago, I trusted Brett Morrison with my life. We served together in Afghanistan. He was my business partner and best friend. I couldn't believe he was capable of treason. What changed your mind? Derek glanced at Chloe, Then back to Agent Reed. I discovered he was having an affair with my fiancée and planning to steal my company. When I investigated his activities more closely, I uncovered the espionage. Agent Reed leaned forward. Mr. Thornfield, I need to be clear about something. If Morrison has been selling classified information, anyone with access to those files could potentially be charged as an accomplice. That includes you. I understand. That's why I'm here voluntarily, with evidence and a witness. Nevertheless, you'll need to submit to a polygraph examination and provide a complete accounting of your activities during the relevant time period. Derek nodded grimly. Whatever you need. Agent Reed's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, then stood. Excuse me for a moment. She left the room, and Derek turned to Chloe. Are you holding anything back? No, I've told him everything. Derek, what's going to happen to me? If you continue cooperating, you'll probably receive immunity. If you lie or hold back information, you'll be prosecuted as an accomplice to espionage. Chloe's face went pale. What about the baby? What about it? If Brett goes to prison, I'll be alone. Derek's expression was ice cold. You were alone the moment you decided to betray me. Agent Reed returned, her expression serious. Mr. Thornfield, we've been monitoring Morrison's communications. He's planning to leave the country tonight. Derek's hands clenched into fists. Where? Moscow, via Vancouver. We believe he's been compromised and is making a run for Russian protection. You can't let him escape. We don't intend to, but we need your help. Morrison has agreed to meet with you this evening, presumably to try to negotiate some kind of deal. We want you to wear a wire and get him to confess to the espionage charges. Derek considered this. What if he's armed? What if he suspects it's a trap? We'll have tactical teams positioned throughout the area. But Mr. Thornfield, I need to be clear. This operation carries significant risk. Morrison is desperate, and desperate people are unpredictable. I'll do it. Derek, no. Chloe grabbed his arm. Brett's been acting crazy since you destroyed his business partnership. He's been drinking heavily, making threats. What if he tries to hurt you? Derek looked down at her hand on his arm, then gently removed it. Brett Morrison stopped being a threat to me the moment I decided to destroy him. Agent Reed studied Derek's face. There's something else. Our investigation has uncovered evidence that Morrison may have been involved in war crimes during his service in Afghanistan. Civilian casualties that were covered up. Derek's expression remained neutral. What kind of evidence? Official reports that were allegedly destroyed, but copies were retained by certain parties. If these allegations are true, Morrison could face a military tribunal in addition to the espionage charges. Derek nodded slowly. I see. Mr. Thornfield, if you have any knowledge of these incidents, now would be the time to share that information. Derek was quiet for a long moment. Agent Reed, Brett Morrison murdered an entire family in Kandahar province, an elderly man, his wife, and their 3 grandchildren. He claimed they were combatants, but they were unarmed civilians. I helped cover it up to protect my unit. Agent Reed's pen stopped moving. You participated in a cover-up of war crimes. Yes, I destroyed evidence and falsified reports. I've regretted it every day since, but I thought I was protecting my men. Mr. Thornfield, you realize this admission could result in serious criminal charges against you? Derek looked directly into her eyes. Agent Reed, Brett Morrison is a traitor, a war criminal, and a murderer. If putting me in prison is the price for ensuring he faces justice, then so be it. Agent Reed stared at him for a long moment, then made a note. Your cooperation will be taken into consideration during any proceedings. She stood and gathered her files. The meeting with Morrison is scheduled for 8 p.m. at Pioneer Courthouse Square. We'll brief you on the technical details in an hour. As they prepared to leave, Derek turned to Chloe one final time. After tonight, you're going to disappear. You're going to take whatever immunity deal the FBI offers, move somewhere far away, and never contact me again. Do you understand? Chloe nodded, tears streaming down her face. Derek, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for everything. Derek's expression softened slightly. I know you are, but sorry doesn't fix anything. He walked away without looking back, leaving Chloe alone with the wreckage of her choices. Tonight, Derek would face his former best friend for the last time. One of them would walk away from that confrontation, and Derek had no intention of letting it be Brett Morrison. Chapter 7. The Confrontation. Pioneer Courthouse Square was bustling with evening commuters when Derek arrived at 7:45 p.m. The wire taped to his chest felt alien, a constant reminder that every word spoken would be recorded for federal prosecutors. Agent Reed's voice came through his nearly invisible earpiece. Target approaching from the northeast corner. Stay calm. Let him talk, and try to get him to admit to the espionage charges. Derek spotted Brett immediately. His former partner looked haggard, almost manic, wearing dark sunglasses despite the overcast sky. He carried a duffel bag and kept glancing over his shoulder as he approached. Derek! Brett's voice was too loud, too forced. Thanks for meeting me, brother. They sat on a bench near the center of the square. Derek noted that Brett's hands were shaking slightly, and there was a telltale bulge under his jacket that suggested he was armed. You look like hell, Brett. Yeah, well, it's been a rough few days. Thanks to you. Brett's voice carried an edge of desperate anger. Derek, we need to work something out. This whole situation has gotten out of hand. Has it? You know it has. Look, I fucked up with Chloe. I admit that. But destroying my entire life over it, taking away my company's shares, that's extreme, even for you. Derek kept his expression neutral. Is that why you called this meeting? To negotiate. Brett leaned closer, lowering his voice. Derek, there are things you don't understand. I'm in serious trouble. Not just with Chloe, not just with the company. I'm talking about life and death trouble. Tell me about Vincent Kozlov. Brett's face went white. How do you know that name? I know a lot of things, Brett. I know about your gambling debts. I know about the Russian money. I know about the classified files you've been selling. Brett stood abruptly, his hand moving toward his jacket. Who told you that? Sit down, Brett. We're just talking. No, we're not just talking. You're fucking recording this, aren't you? Brett's voice rose, causing nearby pedestrians to stare. You son of a bitch, you're wearing a wire. Derek remained seated, his voice calm. Brett, you're paranoid. Sit down and let's work this out. Work what out? You've already destroyed everything. My business, my reputation, my future. You destroyed those things yourself when you decided to betray me. Brett's laugh was bitter, almost hysterical. Betray you? Derek, you have no idea what betrayal looks like. You want to know about Kozlov? You want to know why I had to sell information to the Russians? I'm listening. Brett sat back down, but his hand remained near his weapon. 2 years ago, you left me hanging in Afghanistan. You covered up what happened in Kandahar, sure, but you also left me carrying the guilt alone. You moved on, built your company, got rich, while I've been living with nightmares every single night. So, you decided to become a traitor? I decided to survive. Do you know what PTSD therapy costs? Do you know what it's like to wake up screaming about dead children every night? The gambling wasn't about money. It was about trying to feel something other than guilt. Derek's voice remained steady. That doesn't justify espionage, Brett, doesn't it? You built Apex Protection Services using contacts from our military service. You profited from the same system that covered up my war crimes. At least when I sold information to Kozlov, I was honest about what I was doing. You were selling out your own country. I was selling out a country that abandoned me. Brett's voice cracked. Derek, I killed innocent people, children, and the army just covered it up and sent me home with a pat on the back and a discharge check. Derek felt a flicker of something. Not sympathy, but understanding. Brett, I offer to help you get treatment. I offer to help you build a new life. With Chloe? Yeah, your charity came with strings attached, didn't it? What's that supposed to mean? Brett's smile was ugly. You think Chloe just happened to fall for me? You think this was some random affair? Derek's blood went cold. What are you saying? I'm saying I was recruited by Kozlov 18 months ago. I'm saying they needed access to your company, your files, your life. And I'm saying Chloe was part of the operation from the beginning. Derek's world tilted. You're lying. Am I? Ask yourself, Derek, how did you meet Chloe? At that charity gala, right? The one benefiting Eastern European refugees? The one organized by a foundation that turns out to be funded by Russian shell companies. Derek's hands clenched into fists. No, she played you perfectly. the innocent event coordinator charmed by the wealthy American security consultant. Kozlov's people had been watching you for months, studying your patterns, your weaknesses. They knew you were lonely, isolated by your work. They knew exactly what kind of woman would appeal to you. Agent Reed's voice crackled in Derek's earpiece. Keep him talking. We need more details about the operation. If that's true, Derek said slowly, then why are you telling me? Brett laughed bitterly. Because it doesn't matter anymore. In 3 hours, I'll be on a plane to Vancouver and then to Moscow. Kozlov's extraction plan is already in motion. And Chloe was always expendable. The pregnancy wasn't an accident. It was insurance. They needed something to keep you emotionally invested while I completed the intelligence gathering. Derek's vision went red. Whose baby is it? Does it matter? Could be mine, could be yours, could be some other operatives. The point was to complicate your life enough that you wouldn't notice what was really happening. Derek stood slowly, his entire body trembling with rage. Brett, you're telling me that my entire relationship with Chloe was a Russian intelligence operation? Your entire life has been a Russian intelligence operation, Derek. Your company, your contracts, your personal relationships. We've been inside your head for over a year. Derek's earpiece crackled again. Teams are moving in. Keep him calm for 30 more seconds. But Derek was beyond calm. He was beyond rational thought. In one fluid motion, he grabbed Brett by the throat and slammed him against the bench. You destroyed my life for money. Brett gasped, clawing at Derek's hands. Derek can't breathe. Good. Derek's voice was a whisper of pure hatred. I want you to understand something, Brett. When the FBI arrests you in about 10 seconds, you're going to federal prison for espionage. When military gets done with you, you'll face execution for war crimes. And if somehow you survive all that, I will personally hunt you down and finish what I should have done in Kandahar. Brett's eyes bulged as he fought for air. Around them, FBI tactical teams emerged from the crowd, weapons drawn. Derek Thornfield released the suspect and stepped back. Derek looked into Brett's terrified eyes one last time, then released his grip. Brett collapsed to the ground, gasping and coughing. Brett Morrison, you're under arrest for espionage, conspiracy, and violations of the Espionage Act, Agent Reed announced as tactical officers surrounded them. As they cuffed Brett and read him his rights, Derek felt something cold and empty settle in his chest. His entire life had been a lie. His company, his relationships, his trust, all of it had been manipulated by foreign operatives. But as Derek watched Brett Morrison being dragged away in handcuffs, he realized something else. He wasn't the victim in this story anymore. He was about to become something much more dangerous. Chapter 8. Unraveling Truth. Derek sat in the FBI debriefing room at 2 a.m., his mind reeling from Brett's revelations. Agent Reed placed a cup of coffee in front of him, but Derek ignored it, staring at the photographs spread across the table. Surveillance images of Chloe meeting with unknown contacts, financial records showing payments from Russian shell companies, and communication intercepts that painted a picture of an elaborate intelligence operation. Mr. Thornfield, I need you to understand the scope of what we're dealing with, Agent Reed said, settling into the chair across from him. Based on Morrison's confession and our own investigation, this operation has been running for over 2 years. Derek's voice was hoarse. How much of my life was compromised? That's what we're trying to determine. Tell me about your relationship with Chloe Reynolds, every detail from the beginning. Derek closed his eyes, forcing himself to relive memories that now felt poisoned. We met at the Cascade Foundation Charity Gala 18 months ago. She was the event coordinator. I was there because my company had donated to their refugee assistance program. Did she approach you? Or did you approach her? She bumped into me at the bar, spilled wine on my jacket. Derek's hands clenched. She was so apologetic, insisted on paying for the cleaning. We started talking. Agent Reed made notes. What did you discuss? My work initially. She seemed genuinely interested in security consulting. Asked intelligent questions about protecting vulnerable populations. I was impressed by her knowledge. What kind of knowledge? Derek thought back, seeing the conversation with new eyes. She knew about specific military contracts, current events in Eastern Europe, Details about refugee movements that most civilians wouldn't know. Red flags you missed because you were attracted to her. Exactly. Derek's voice carried bitter self-recrimination. She played me perfectly. Every conversation, every shared interest, every moment of apparent vulnerability, it was all calculated. Agent Reed slid another photograph across the table. Do you recognize this man? Derek studied the image. A well-dressed man in his 50s with silver hair and cold eyes. No. Should I? Dmitry Volkov, Kozlov's lieutenant. He's been in Portland for the past 6 months, coordinating the operation. Our surveillance shows him meeting regularly with both Morrison and Reynolds. Derek stared at the photograph, feeling sick. How many people were involved? At least a dozen that we know of. This wasn't a simple espionage operation. It was a comprehensive penetration of your personal and professional life. Agent Reed's phone buzzed. She glanced at it, then looked up grimly. Mr. Thornfield, we have a problem. Chloe Reynolds is missing. Derek's head snapped up. What do you mean missing? She left the safe house about an hour ago. Told the agents she was going to the bathroom and never came back. Security footage shows her leaving through a service exit. Derek stood abruptly. She's running. That's our assumption. We've issued a BOLO alert and contacted airport security, but Derek's secure phone rang. Unknown number. He showed it to Agent Reed, who nodded and activated recording equipment. Derek Thornfield. Hello, Derek. Chloe's voice was different, colder, more controlled. The vulnerable act was gone completely. Chloe, where are you? Somewhere safe. I wanted to call and thank you. Thank me? For destroying Brett Morrison so thoroughly. He was becoming a liability, and you solved that problem for us. Derek felt his world shift again. Us. Chloe laughed, and the sound was like ice. Did you really think Brett was the mastermind? He's a broken soldier with gambling debts and PTSD. Useful, but hardly strategic material. You're the real operative. Very good. It only took you 18 months to figure that out. Agent Reed was frantically signaling to technicians, try to trace the call. Derek kept Chloe talking. How long have you been working for the Russians? Since I was 16. Moscow University, then SVR training. I've been Chloe Reynolds for 3 years, long enough to build a complete identity. And Brett, a convenient patsy. We recruited him 2 years ago when his gambling debts made him desperate. But he was never more than a foot soldier. Derek's voice was deadly quiet. What about the baby? What baby, Derek? I'm not pregnant. I never was. Brett thought I was because I told him so. You thought I might be because I let you think so. It was just another layer of manipulation. Derek closed his eyes, feeling the full weight of his deception. The positive pregnancy test, easily faked. The morning sickness, acting. The doctor's appointments, meeting with my handlers. Why are you telling me this? Because my mission is complete, and I wanted you to understand exactly how thoroughly you've been played. For 18 months, I've had access to your home, your office, your most classified files. I've photographed every document, recorded every conversation, mapped every security protocol. Agent Reed passed Derek a note. Keep her talking. We're close to a trace. What was the endgame? Derek asked. Your company was just the beginning. Through Apex Protection Services, we've identified weaknesses in dozens of government facilities. Your client list reads like a directory of American intelligence assets. We've been inside the Pentagon, the CIA, the NSA, all through contracts you provided. Derek felt sick. How many people are going to die because of the information you stole? That's not really my concern. I'm just a data collector. You're a traitor. I'm a patriot, just not to your country. The line went quiet for a moment. Then Chloe continued. Derek, I want you to know that I did enjoy parts of our relationship. You're a good man, and under different circumstances, I might have actually fallen for you. But you didn't. No, I didn't. Goodbye, Derek. The line went dead. Agent Reed looked up from her equipment. We traced the call to a cell tower near the airport, but she's probably already gone. Derek slumped back in his chair, the full magnitude of his situation finally sinking in. She's right. I've been completely played. My company, my security clearances, my entire life, it's all compromised. Mr. Thornfield, we're going to need you to provide a complete inventory of every file, every client, every piece of classified information that might have been exposed. Derek nodded numbly. It's everything. She had access to everything. Agent Reed's expression was sympathetic but professional. There's something else. Based on what we've learned, the Justice Department is likely to bring charges against you for compromising national security. What kind of charges? Negligent handling of classified information, failure to report suspected espionage, possibly treason, if they can prove you knowingly assisted the operation. Derek looked up at her with hollow eyes. I didn't know. I believe you. But ignorance isn't a defense in espionage cases. Derek stood and walked to the window, looking out at the Portland skyline. In one night, he'd lost everything. His company, his reputation, his freedom, his faith in his own judgment. But as he stared into the darkness, Derek felt something else stirring. Not despair, but cold, focused rage. Chloe Reynolds and her handlers thought they'd won. They thought Derek Thornfield was finished. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Chapter 9. Final Justice. 3 months later, Derek sat in a federal courthouse in Washington, D.C., waiting for his sentencing hearing. The government had offered him a plea deal, 5 years in federal prison in exchange for his cooperation in identifying compromised assets and rebuilding security protocols. His lawyer, Patricia Hawkins, had advised him to take it. Derek had other plans. All rise for the Honorable Judge Elizabeth Warren, the bailiff announced. Judge Warren, a stern woman in her 60s, took her seat and reviewed the case file. Mr. Thornfield, you've pleaded guilty to negligent handling of classified information and failure to report suspected espionage. Before I impose sentence, do you have anything to say? Derek stood slowly. Your Honor, I do. Proceed. 3 months ago, I thought I was the victim of a Russian intelligence operation. I believed I had been deceived, manipulated, and betrayed by people I trusted. I was wrong. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Agent Reed, sitting in the gallery, looked confused. I wasn't the victim, Your Honor. I was the bait. Derek reached into his jacket and withdrew a thick manila envelope. Your Honor, I'd like to present evidence that this entire operation was a counterintelligence mission authorized by the Department of Defense. The prosecutor shot to his feet. Objection. This is the first we've heard of any. Overruled, Judge Warren said, her eyes fixed on Derek. Mr. Thornfield approached the bench. Derek walked forward and handed the envelope to the judge. Inside were classified documents bearing DoD seals, authorization codes, and a signature of General Michael Harrison, Derek's former commanding officer. Judge Warren studied the papers for several minutes, her expression growing more serious. Mr. Thornfield, these documents appear to authorize you to conduct a false flag operation against Russian intelligence assets. Is that correct? Yes, Your Honor. 18 months ago, military intelligence identified Vincent Kozlov's organization as a significant threat to national security. They needed a way to identify and neutralize his entire network. Derek turned to face the courtroom. The military couldn't conduct the operation directly because Kozlov's people were too sophisticated. They needed someone with legitimate access to classified information, someone who could be convincingly compromised. Agent Reed was staring at Derek in shock. That's impossible. We monitored everything. You monitored what I wanted you to monitor, Derek said calmly. Every document Chloe Reynolds photographed, every file she accessed, every piece of intelligence she stole. It was all carefully prepared disinformation. Derek walked back to the defendant's table and opened his briefcase, withdrawing a laptop computer. Your Honor, with the court's permission, I'd like to demonstrate something. Judge Warren nodded, and Derek opened the laptop. The screen showed a real-time satellite feed of a compound in Eastern Europe. This is a facility outside Moscow where Kozlov's organization has been analyzing the intelligence they believe they stole from my company. What they don't know is that every piece of information was designed to lead them into a trap. On the screen, military vehicles were surrounding the compound. Derek checked his watch. In approximately 30 seconds, a joint U.S.-NATO task force will capture Vincent Kozlov, Dmitry Volkov, and 43 other members of their espionage network. The courtroom was dead silent as they watched the operation unfold on screen. Explosions lit up the facility as special forces breached the perimeter. Derek turned back to Judge Warren. The documents they've been acting on for the past year contained false information about military installations, fake security protocols, and invented intelligence assets. Every move they've made based on stolen intelligence has been predicted and monitored. What about Brett Morrison? Agent Reed demanded. What about his confession? Derek's smile was cold. Brett Morrison is exactly what he appeared to be, a traitor motivated by gambling debts and psychological instability. His recruitment by Kozlov's people was genuine, which made him the perfect entry point for our operation. And Chloe Reynolds? Major Elena Volkov, SVR-trained operative and Dmitry Volkov's daughter. She's currently in federal custody at an undisclosed location, where she's been for the past 3 months. Agent Reed stood up, her face flushed with anger. Then who the hell made that phone call from the airport? Derek's expression didn't change. I did. Voice modulation technology. I needed you to believe she had escaped, so you wouldn't question why the investigation was being transferred to military jurisdiction. Judge Warren leaned forward. Mr. Thornfield, if these documents are authentic, why wasn't this court informed of the classified nature of your activities? Because the operation required absolute authenticity, Your Honor. Everyone, the FBI, the prosecutors, my own lawyer, had to believe I was genuinely compromised. Any hint that this was a counterintelligence operation would have compromised the mission. Derek gestured to the laptop screen, where the satellite feed showed Russian operatives being led away in handcuffs. As of this moment, we've dismantled the largest Russian espionage network operating in North America. We've identified over 200 intelligence assets, captured classified weapons technology, and intercepted communications that prevented 3 separate terrorist attacks. The prosecutor was frantically whispering with FBI agents. Patricia Hawkins looked stunned. Judge Warren studied the DoD documents again, then looked up at Derek. Mr. Thornfield, these authorizations appear genuine, but I'll need verification from the Pentagon before I can proceed. Of course, Your Honor. Derek's secure phone buzzed. He glanced at it, then showed the screen to the judge. That's General Harrison. He's waiting outside to provide testimony if needed. Judge Warren called a recess, and Derek was escorted to a holding room where General Harrison was waiting. A distinguished man in his 50s wearing dress blues decorated with commendations from 3 decades of service. Son, that the general said, clasping Derek's hand. Outstanding work. The intelligence we gathered from this operation will protect American lives for years to come. What about Brett Morrison? Morrison will serve his time. His crimes were real, even if they serve our purposes. Some betrayals can't be forgiven, even when they're useful. Derek nodded. And Elena Volkov? She'll be exchanged for American assets, currently held in Russia. Standard prisoner swap. Derek was quiet for a moment. General, what happens now? Now, you disappear. New identity, new life, substantial